My head is hurting from theorizing about the future of Final Fantasy XIV. That or a lack of sleep. But we have even more theories provided by you, yes you, that today we are going to react to. We're going to break down and see if we can figure out the future, nay, the history yet set for Final Fantasy XIV. Hello, everybody. It's your boy Jmulls. And seriously, you guys have some bangers. Let's start off with one I'm not sure is particularly likely, but if it is, oh my god, this would be heat. We have at Jin698 who says, I'm still saying a shard will be a primal. The whole shard will be a primal. Like Zanarkand was a dream of the faith. Zanarkand will be the primal. I wasn't that big of a fan of that plot reveal in Final Fantasy X, but in the confines of the story of Final Fantasy XIV, that could be so dang interesting and cool. And I'm just wondering how they could actually pull something like that off. Would they take one of the already known about shards and just say, yeah, actually, plot twist, when Vanas split the source up into all the different shards, we miscounted. It's supposed to be one under than what we actually got, but they made another one as a whole different primal, or at least a small group did. Maybe they could go in that direction. Or we find some way to count the current shards, and we realize there's one more than what there should be, and that new one, that is actually basically a primal, that perhaps some denizens of another shard, to evade like maybe their own catastrophe, found a way to concoct and escape to it, and then they became tempered by that shard. How would we go about resolving that? Would we keep it around? Would we find some kind of way to possibly maybe rejoin that shard, if that could even be achieved? Would we find some kind of way to like perhaps even destroy it outright? I think there's a really interesting story that they could tell if they go in this direction. And also, going from what we kind of suspect right now with this whole great withering thing and this great basically calamity that is going to come to not only, I imagine, the ninth, but all the other shards and possibly the source as well. It could be a great way to put everything on its head if instead of like trying to help out the other shards from withering away, like what I imagine we're probably going to do, right? If for this very specific shard, for this very specific reason, we have to find a way to allow it to wither away. It could take the story and really turn it on its head. I think it'd be a very interesting like plot twist. I'm not sold on that being the direction they're going to go in, but I've said this before. I really want there to be some kind of big signifying new event to mark this new era and to really raise the stakes. Something like this would be so dang cool. And you gotta admit, it would get people talking. And I think it would be another example of them taking an element from the story of a previous Final Fantasy game, like Dontrell did with like FF9, right? But taking an element from a previous Final Fantasy game and finding a way to make it unique and at home in the story of Final Fantasy XIV. But speaking of, let's lean into that idea, taking an idea, a plot point, if you will, from a previous Final Fantasy game and finding a way to make it work in Final Fantasy XIV. And let's revisit Final Fantasy IX, courtesy of at Ivan Lugo -SR1 World Quest, who says, first time commenting, loving the theories. Thank you very much, and hello to you. My theory, I feel like we are going to get a Garland FF9-like character or a ship or maybe a primal that'll give us the red eye and wipe out Cheno or send us to the ninth lost and alone or with Kryl since we are supposed to see more of her. Finding more about Lindblum, having the Ifna tree play a role or bridge in a sin from Final Fantasy X, I think we're going to the ninth. It could be a very interesting thing for them to do. I would love an entire expansion that's kind of like the very beginning of Shadowbringers, where they just whisk us away to a shard, but we're actually alone and we have to basically start from zero again. That could be a really interesting tonal refresh and a way to have a story that is very much spearheaded by the Warrior of Light and a bunch of new characters without feeling reliant on old characters, but also writing it in such a way where it feels not haphazardly written to keep the Scions out of imminent like world-ending catastrophe, anything like that. I think a character like Garland from Final Fantasy IX, I don't know if they'll just call him like Garland, considering we already have a Cid. But I mean, they did do Golbez from Final Fantasy IV, so it's not outside of their wheelhouse, you know? But a character like Garland from Final Fantasy IX, this big giant plot twist, that does feel like something that they absolutely could do, because we still know basically next to nothing about any of the other shards. We don't know how advanced their civilizations are. We don't know if they're on the brink of destruction. We don't know if they're just flourishing flourishing communities there? We simply don't know. And they could easily take one of those shards and just say, yeah, our garland comes from this shard. Like, they could easily go that route. I don't know if we're going to go to the rest of the 9th properly or not, because the way they really wrote it was that the idea right now was that it was supposed to be completely overtaken by the lightning calamity, right? But they did establish in 7.4 that there can be flourishing communities there. Maybe flourishing is the wrong word to use or something, but you can still establish a community in the world of the 9th. Cheno was the perfect example of this. It may not be big, it may not be boisterous or anything, but it can exist. I just kind of feel like I don't really see them going like a full 6-zone expansion set on the 9th. I just don't really see that happening. I don't think it's outside of the world of possibilities or anything like that. I just don't see it being the direction that they go in after setting up the 9th like they have throughout Dawn Trail. Feels more likely if we're going to have an expansion set entirely on another shard, it wouldn't be the 9th, it would be one of the other shards. Maybe we go back to Cheno if they don't pull the trigger and just wipe it out along with the rest of the 9. Maybe we go back to Living Memory for whatever reason. I just don't really see us getting a whole bunch of new zones in the 9th, but who knows, right? Like, they're the writers, they could go in whatever direction they really want. And like I say, I don't feel as if we're going to be exploring the 9th all that much more in the future, at least in terms of new zones and all that. However, they did establish the 9th as a key potential consequence of our actions right now. It just really depends upon what direction they're going to go in with this story, and are we going to actually be able to successfully save the 9th, or because of our own ignorance, are we going to essentially allow the 9th to wither away? Time will tell. God, I just need that trailer for 7.5. I just need FanFest overall. I need to have an idea as to where we're going. I am so morbidly curious now. Going off something we were just talking about, we have at Mr. Shoe 83 who says, since we fought so hard to stop the rejoinings at what is, for now, likely the halfway point of the Final Fantasy XIV story, we probably now have to actually bring about a rejoining of some sort to save the source and its shards. This would be the change of course Halmarut mentions. Hydaelyn restricted the flow of ether back to the source, and the fragments of Zodiac kept ether flowing within the source and its shards. With both gone, ether is rapidly flowing back to the source and not being replenished in the shards, causing the shards to wither. The rapidly transferred ether from all the remaining shards may also cause issues in the source, like a massive calamity that will need to be wintered through. I see what you did there. Assi and Azim likely saw us in Elpis. An early Pandemonium cutscene implies they knew of the Warrior of Light and used their full-powered version of our Echo to see our past, present, and maybe future. They refused to help both Emmett and Venat in the past because they knew they had to create a method of rejoining for us that wouldn't sacrifice anyone, perhaps by merging the worlds. The key is either a failed attempt or incomplete part of their solution, and will need to find clues they left behind to finish their work. I absolutely adore this theory. Oh my god. It basically incorporates every element of what I hope is incorporated in the story moving forward. I want it to be Azim focused. I want it to be focused on the Warrior of Light. I want there to be some kind of big event where we have to impact some kind of large-scale change upon the worlds. Like, it just has everything. And unless I'm massively just forgetting some very important plot detail, this does feel as if it could be rather plausible, maybe with a few tweaks here and there. Also, I just love the narrative, almost poetry that would go on there, with us having dealt with the Ascian / the Ancients before and Emmett Silk, and then us in the current predicament basically having to follow in their footsteps and cause a rejoining of, I don't know, some shard in order to basically save our world. It would create a very interesting dynamic there between what the Ascians and the Ancients were, as well as Azim, but also us as the current Warrior of Light. I think we have a really interesting way as well to like bridge the gap between the Hydaelyn Zodiac arc as well as this current next, like, I don't know what we're gonna call it, the Withering arc. It also makes sense to me, at least, with the Astral Umbral stuff that we learned back in Shadowbringers. Like, it just makes a lot of sense. I can also just imagine some of these moments happening, some of these plot reveals happening, and just thinking how cool that could be with context, with like proper pacing in the story. That would be so dang cool. I want there to be interesting stakes, but I also want it to feel like, hey, we have to learn more about this world, and sometimes we might have to make choices that we're not necessarily all that comfortable with, or that don't have a guaranteed success rate. great, but it could possibly be better than the alternative. I think that'd be a really interesting way to go about doing this new narrative arc. And it also goes back to an element of storytelling that I talk about on occasion when you have a story that had the scale and the spectacle of like Endwalker, where we went to the edge of the universe to fight the concept of despair made manifest as a little bird girl, right? In order to not just save like Aetheris, but also the entire universe. You can't just keep upping the stakes like that from there, like it's Dragon Ball. Because at some point, you distance yourself too much from the heart and soul of what people fell in love with this franchise and this story to begin with. Some would argue we've already gotten there, but I would argue, after a story like that, the best thing to do sometimes is to have it be very personal. Have it be about your character, our relationship to Azum, and about a specific location that we really care about. So instead of the entire, like, universe that we're dealing with, we're just dealing with Aetheris and the various shards. It's still grandiose and epic, and we can go from, like, small scale, we went on a quest with Wooklamite, woo, to we need to make sure that all these various worlds can continue to coexist with each other, and not just wither away and just die on the vine. And by doing so, it would give us an opportunity to explore the character of Azum, which I imagine a lot of people, myself included, really want to do. Possibly also the Warrior of Light. I just think it's really dang cool. Also, I think it is kind of clear right now that there is some connection between the key, as it currently is, with Azum. Because when we picked up the key back when we fought Queen's Fiend, or like Endless Fiend back in 7.0, it had the Azum logo over it. Like, that happened when we picked it up. So to me, it's clear the foreshadowing there is supposed to signify that there is a connection between the key that we currently have and Azum. Would not surprise me at all, because Azum was supposed to be this great traveler, if that key eventually is revealed to have come from Azum, and perhaps was one of the ways that he got about the various shards, which wouldn't really work with the story that we currently have, but with how little we actually know and understand about Azum, it really wouldn't surprise me if they have a few plot twists up their sleeves when it comes to that character that could possibly like rectify that impossibility that seems to exist for that. Or maybe Azum was somehow aware of what Venat would do, and before the great like sundering, before Venat split all the different shards up, maybe Azum created the key for someone down the line to be able to utilize. Maybe it's something like that. Really wouldn't surprise me if that is somehow or some way the connection between the key and Azum. Next up, we have at Captain Kala, who says, something I've been mulling, let's go! It may not be an 8.0 thing, but maybe 9.0. I'm wondering if by not acting this in Alexandria back to the 9th, we've set the stage for rejoining. We made it worse by going through living memory, maybe. Either way, we have a solid link to the 9th, and maybe that means it's easier for rejoining to happen, or at least a partial one, where the source sucks all of the ether out of the 9th, making it wither. This triggers a cataclysm on the source, but it happens while we're on vacation, this time to the 1st. After seeing how well Alexandria meshed with the source, the Scions in the 1st visiting and investigating whether or not it's possible to move all of Norvrant to the source, plopping it down the middle of the ocean, or sea, or someplace out of the way. While we're there, the 1st could even go out of sync with the source timeline-wise, so when we come back, there's been a cataclysm, but the systems we put in place made it more survivable than the one Graha went back in time to prevent. 9.0 could be a WoW Cataclysm-style expansion that sees the world reworked and maybe upscaled, with some spaghetti code TM removed. I wasn't sure they'd take that approach, but with the recent talk from Yoshi P, I'm wondering if it's possible. A time skip at some point in the future is something that I do think is probably coming at some point, and I do think it would be really cool to have some kind of Cataclysm-esque scenario happen for the story of Final Fantasy XIV. Now, I don't know how likely that is to actually happen, because if they go that route, it has to get really dark, right? And there would almost certainly be a body count. And yeah, don't get me wrong, quite a few people died during the final days of Endwalker. Absolutely. But are they willing to get that dark again? That's my main question. I hope they are, and I think they are probably willing. It's just Dawntrail didn't really call for anything like that. But with the recent tonal shift in the MSQ over the last couple of patches, with the increased writing quality as each patch went on, and with the things they're really foreshadowing and pretty much warning about, it really does feel as if they're building up to some kind of big event that's going to happen. Whether that happens in 7.5, 8.0, 0.1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 9.0, it's impossible to tell right now, right? But I think when it comes to doing something like World of Warcraft Cataclysm, I don't think, especially with how far removed we are currently from Cataclysm, people really fully understand just how pivotal of an expansion that really was. And some would argue that it didn't necessarily work out for World of Warcraft because people had investment in old Azeroth. They cared about those zones, about those locations and the stories that were told there. And then with Cataclysm, all of that was fundamentally changed and it no longer felt like the Azeroth a lot of people came to know and love. And a lot of people use Cata as a moment when a lot of people had that like sunk cost fallacy, that investment in the world snipped away because the world that they fell in love with was no more really. It changed. And I could honestly see some people make an argument as to why Final Fantasy XIV wouldn't try to do something similar based on the reactions and sentiment that World of Warcraft got because of Cataclysm. And I can understand that to a degree, but I do think there's a fundamental difference between World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, and that is the style of story that is told here. Final Fantasy XIV tells a far more traditional RPG-paced storyline. World of Warcraft is trying to do that and has tried to do that for like a while at this point. However, let's also be fair here. In-game storytelling is just handled fundamentally differently between Final Fantasy XIV and WoW. And while WoW recently is trying to make that a far more important element to the overall experience, WoW was always a gameplay-driven experience. And the types of stories that worked in WoW for so long wasn't that carefully paced on-rails experience that Final Fantasy XIV presents. And in a story like Final Fantasy XIV, I think you can do something like that Cataclysm scenario and really make that work because you can immediately build off of that in a narrative way that is well-paced, well-executed, that continues to build from there. Whereas for World of Warcraft, yes, there was some like throughput events that like brought you from one expansion into the next, absolutely. But for a lion's share, I'd argue, of the player base, it largely did feel like a villain of the expansion, and we just moved from like one villain to the next. We went from like Illidan and Kil'jaeden in the Burning Crusade, then to Arthas and Wrath, then to Deathwing and Cata, then Garrosh and the Shah in Mists of Pandaria, then like funnily enough Garrosh again in World of the Draenor, but also the Burning Legion, then the Burning Legion again in Legion, okay, etc., etc., etc. During that period of WoW, they suffered from the perception of every expansion not being too reliant on the previous one narratively, and the connections existing feeling as if they just kind of exist to technically get us from one experience to the next, whereas it largely felt like, oh, they want to do these kinds of things, they want to have these kinds of aesthetics, they'll just make an excuse to make it work. Whether or not that's actually what happened, that's the feeling a lot of people had with World of Warcraft. That is not the case with Final Fantasy XIV, where it's like there's a throughput narrative, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and connecting points, and pacing, and character work, and moments that connect you from a realm reborn into Heavensward, into the Heavensward patches, into Stormblood, into the Stormblood patches, then into Shadowbringers, etc., etc., etc. So if you do something like a Cataclysm and you fundamentally change it, not just to Eorzea, but also just to Theros overall, you can write that story to where we can like immediately pick it up and go from there, kind of like back in Final Fantasy VI with the World of Ruin. And also with Dawnchill, like this being like Arc 1 of this next new big narrative arc, unless you want to count the Endwalker patches, which I guess technically should count. Maybe they're more like a prologue of anything, but still, one of the biggest moments, the biggest plot twists is that you could take a chunk from another shard, the 9th, and you can just slap it on the source. That's basically what happened with Alexandria. And sure, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that felt very deliberate. And it really wouldn't surprise me if that plot device is utilized again in the future. It wouldn't surprise me if we do something like that with like maybe Treno or something, maybe, or maybe with another shard, or maybe with Northrend, and we just say, well, we tried fixing it in Aiden, but like, oh my god, dude, this is taking forever. Or maybe some kind of withering event happens there, and the first is properly going to die. So we're just like, okay, let's just take Northrend, slap it in the middle of the ocean, nothing's there anyways, who cares about sea currents, right? Just like slap it there, we'll be good. But maybe they go in that direction, I kind of doubt that, but like maybe they could. I definitely feel as if they're trying to build us up to some kind of big event, whether that is the destruction of the 9th, whether that is another rejoining and we actually properly see it, probably not to like the degree that causes a worldwide catastrophe like in ages past, but like some kind of event that really like punches the story and punches us all in the gut and go, whoa, okay, things have just fundamentally changed here. Now that time dilation thing really seems interesting to me because it feels inevitable at some point. The only main concern is like how they go about like executing on that gameplay wise. Do they just make like another version of the first that is like aged up and they allow people to visit like the old version of Northrend? It's just like not canonical, or do they just wholesale like change the NPCs? But if you want to go back into the old quest, you could still do them, because it does feel like a time skip for like either the twins or like Reen and Gaia is like inevitable. I don't have like any solid evidence to back that up, don't get me wrong here. It's just something I feel in my gut where I'm like, it really does feel like they're going to have one of those moments where it's like, been a while, huh? Hasn't it been Warrior of Light? Something along those lines. It really feels like that moment is inevitable. I just don't know which group of characters they're gonna do it with. Something to definitely think about. I can't imagine, by the way, the amount of back-end work that it would involve to like sort out Final Fantasy XIV's code, and like when they would even find the time for that. Like you would absolutely probably have to like make a separate team for that or something. I don't even know. And they could also just say, well, screw it. Let's just focus on making good fights and a good story, and we can just tough out the spaghetti code. Like that might just be the MO. It wouldn't really surprise me. But yeah, definitely something to consider and think about. And here's where you come in. Leave a comment down below with your own theory about the future of the story of Final Fantasy XIV. And what do you think's going to happen with 8.0? Where do you think we're going to go? What new jobs do you think we're going to get, if any? Do you think a big plot twist is coming, and what do you think it is? I'd love to hear your thoughts, hear your opinions, and hear your theories, and I may react to them in a future video. And while you're down there, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, well, you should leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And if you're hungry for even more theories, don't worry. I got you covered. You know what I mean, though? I got you covered. Check out this video right here for more. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.